Picture this. The morning of January 21st, 2025, East Room of the White House. Standing in a row are the chairman of SoftBank, the chairman of Oracle, and a 39-year-old man in a dark suit who, 14 months earlier, had been fired by his own board on a Friday afternoon. The president walks in. He shakes their hands. And then he announces on national television that these three companies, together with the man in the middle, are going to invest $500 billion in artificial intelligence infrastructure on American soil. The largest infrastructure project in the history of American technology. He calls it Stargate. The man in the middle nods, almost shyly. He does not say much. He does not have to, because this is the moment the architecture stops being invisible. Hold on that image. A man who had been escorted out of his own company by a Google Meet, fired in 28 minutes by 4 directors who said he was not consistently candid, is now standing inside the White House while the President of the United States announces an infrastructure project the size of a mid-sized national budget, with him as the chief operator. 14 months. That is the entire span of time it took him to go from terminated employee to the man the federal government wanted standing next to it on the day it announced the future. And the strange thing, the thing almost nobody pauses on long enough, is how natural it looked, like he had always been there, like the chair had been waiting. This is a story about that chair, about the architecture of how it was built, about the hidden plan, and we will come back to that phrase because it does a lot of work, and it does not mean what you might think it means. The man's name is Sam Altman. He is the chief executive of OpenAI, the company that built ChatGPT, the company that, by the spring of 2026, was being valued in private markets at over $850 billion on annual revenue that, according to multiple reports, had only just crossed $25 billion. $850 billion on $25 billion of revenue, much of it unprofitable. To put that in scale, that valuation is larger than the gross domestic product of all but 18 countries on Earth. For a company that, by its own admission, is not yet sure it can pay for what it has promised to build. To understand how a person ends up at the center of that, you have to go back, not to OpenAI earlier, back to a private school chapel in St. Louis, Missouri, around the year 2000. There is a 16-year-old boy at the front of the room. The school is John Burroughs. The room is full of teenagers and faculty, and the boy stands up and tells everyone there that he is gay. In St. Louis, in a private prep school, in 2000. There is no precedent in that chapel for what he has just done. The room, and by accounts that have circulated since, does not erupt. It tilts. It rearranges itself around him. He has changed the social geometry by simply refusing to participate in the silence. He did not do it as an act of rebellion. He did it as an act of clarification. That instinct, to surface the uncomfortable truth in order to take control of the conversation around it, is something he never lost. He was 8 when he got his first computer, an Apple Macintosh. He took it apart, put it back together, built things. By Stanford, he was studying computer science, and by his own later admission, learning more from late-night poker games with his classmates than from lectures. Poker, he would tell the New York Times years later, taught him how to read patterns in people across time, how to make decisions on imperfect information. He was 19 when he dropped out. He had built a location-sharing app called Looped with his then-boyfriend and a few classmates, and they had been admitted into the very first batch of an obscure startup accelerator called Y Combinator, run by a programmer essayist named Paul Graham. The accelerator gave each founder $6,000. $6,000 in 3 months of advice. Out of that first batch came companies that would later be worth tens of billions. Looped, in the end, was not one of them. It raised more than $30 million in venture capital. It signed deals with major wireless carriers, and it never quite found its users. In 2012, it was sold to a banking company called Green Dot for $43 million. A clean exit, but not a triumph. Sam Altman, at 26, had run a startup for 7 years and produced a modest result. By any reasonable measure, he should have been a footnote. But here is the thing that did not show up on the spreadsheet. Paul Graham had been watching him the whole time. Not the company, the man, the way he handled investors, the way he handled bad news, The way he handled the fact that the board of his own company had, on two separate occasions, tried to remove him. The way he survived those attempts and kept going. Graham watched all of that, and in 2014, when he stepped down as president of Y Combinator, he handed the seat, the most influential seat in early-stage startup investing on Earth, to Sam Altman. Sam was 28 years old. Read that sentence again. The man who founded the most powerful startup accelerator in the world chose, as his successor, a 28-year-old whose own company had failed to take off. Almost nobody in Silicon Valley would have made that bet. Graham made it. And here's the part worth pausing on, because it is the first visible piece of the architecture. Altman did not get that seat because his startup succeeded. He got it because the people who watched him closely realized something the spreadsheet could not measure. They realized he had a model of how systems work. He understood that the people in charge of an institution are rarely the smartest people inside it, and that this gap creates an opening. He did not need to be the smartest person at Looped. He needed to be the one who could see the whole board. Under his leadership, Y Combinator funded a generation. Airbnb, Stripe, Coinbase, Reddit, DoorDash, Instacart. He pushed the firm into hard technology, fusion, biotech, supersonic flight, nuclear fission. And in December of 2015, with a small group of co-founders that included Elon Musk, Greg Brockman, Ilya Sutskever, and a handful of others, he co-founded a nonprofit research organization called OpenAI. The mission, as written in its founding charter, was almost utopian: to ensure that artificial general intelligence, meaning in their definition, machines capable of outperforming humans at most economically valuable work, would benefit all of humanity, not Microsoft, not investors. All of humanity. They committed $1 billion to the project. They said they would publish their research openly. They said they would not pursue commercial returns. 3 years later, that picture broke. Musk wanted to take over OpenAI to compete more aggressively with Google. Altman declined. Musk left and, more importantly, took his money with him. OpenAI was suddenly a nonprofit committed to building the most expensive technology in human history without enough money to build it. So in 2019, Altman did something that, in retrospect, was the single most important corporate maneuver of the entire AI era. He created a for-profit subsidiary inside the nonprofit, a capped profit structure. Investors would get returns up to a cap, and everything beyond that cap would flow back to the nonprofit. The nonprofit board would still control the whole thing. On paper, it preserved the mission. In practice, it built a vehicle that could absorb $13 billion from Microsoft, which 3 months later it did. $13 billion from Microsoft. To put that into something you can hold, that is more than the entire annual research budget of MIT, Stanford, and Caltech combined. In exchange, OpenAI got the compute it would have needed a decade to build on its own, and Microsoft got a share of profits up to a cap, plus the right to integrate OpenAI's models into Office, Bing, Azure, and almost everything else they sold. Some called it a partnership. Others called it a hostage exchange, where both sides agreed to be hostages. They were now welded together, and the nonprofit board, the entity that, in theory, controlled the whole thing, became in practice a polite formality until November 2023, when the polite formality decided to stop being polite. Friday, November 17th, around noon Pacific time, Sam Altman, who is in Las Vegas for a Formula One race, gets a Google Meet invite from a board member named Ilya Sutskever, the chief scientist, his close collaborator, the man who, more than any other, had built the technical foundation underneath ChatGPT. The meeting lasts 28 minutes. By the end of it, Sam Altman is no longer the chief executive of OpenAI. The reason given, in the public statement that goes out shortly afterwards, is that he was not consistently candid in his communications with the board. That is the only public reason. There is no detail. There is no list of specific incidents. There is, by the standards of corporate communication, a vacuum where the explanation should be. And that vacuum, it turns out, is where the story actually lives. Because what happens over the next 72 hours is the most rapid reversal of corporate power in the history of American technology. Within hours, Microsoft's chief executive, Satya Nadella, is on the phone, not to negotiate, to plan. By Sunday night, he announces that Altman, along with Brockman, will join Microsoft to lead a new advanced AI research division. By Monday morning, an open letter is circulating inside OpenAI signed by, eventually, over 740 of the company's roughly 770 employees, threatening to resign and follow Altman to Microsoft unless the board reverses itself and resigns. Among the signatures, near the top, Ilya Sutskever, the man who had voted to fire him. Within 48 hours of casting that vote, Sutskever has publicly said that he regrets it. By Tuesday, Sam Altman is back. The board that fired him is, with one exception, gone. A new board is constituted, and the company that, on Friday afternoon, was a nonprofit governed by an independent board has, by Wednesday morning, become something else entirely. Whatever it is now, it is not what it was. If you have been watching closely, you have already seen the architecture beginning to assemble. Before we go on, because this is where the picture gets larger, let me ask you to do one thing. If you are finding this useful, take a second, hit subscribe, hit the like button. We are building on this channel a small community of people who want to understand the mechanics of power in the present tense. Not the press release version, the actual one. Now back to it, because here is what becomes visible after November 2023. Altman comes back, and within months he is doing things that no founder of a nonprofit research organization would normally be doing. He is at the World Economic Forum, on stage with heads of state. He is testifying before the United States Senate, calmly asking for a federal licensing regime for advanced AI models. Read the testimony carefully. He is asking the government to require licenses for any company that wants to build models above a certain capability threshold. On its face, this looks like a man volunteering to be regulated. Look closer, and you see something stranger. Licensing regimes, by their nature, favor the largest incumbents, the companies that already have the lawyers, the compliance teams, the relationships. A small lab in a garage cannot afford to comply. A startup cannot afford to comply. But OpenAI can. Microsoft can. Google can. Asking for a license to do what you are already doing, at a scale only you and a few others can afford, is not surrendering to regulation. It is helping to write the rules of the moat around your own castle. He did this on television. He did it in front of the United States Senate. And almost nobody at the time named what was actually happening. That is one board, the regulatory board. There are two more, the capital board. By 2025, Altman has assembled a capital structure that has no precedent in the history of private companies. Microsoft's $13 billion is now joined by deals with Oracle worth, by some accounts, $300 billion in cloud commitments. NVIDIA announces an investment of up to $100 billion. AMD signs a deal where OpenAI receives stock in AMD itself, up to 10% of the chipmaker, in exchange for committing to use its next-generation chips. SoftBank commits another $19 billion to Stargate, and then there are the sovereign wealth funds. MGX, the Abu Dhabi fund, comes in at $7 billion. Critics begin to use a word, circular. The chip companies are investing in OpenAI. OpenAI is using the money to buy chips from those same chip companies. The cloud providers are investing in OpenAI. OpenAI is using the money to rent capacity from those same providers. By the autumn of 2025, OpenAI has lined up over $1 trillion in commitments to data centers and compute, while its actual revenue on an annualized basis was running somewhere between $4 and $25 billion. The valuation on private markets climbs to $850 billion. Then $1 trillion is mentioned, out loud, by people who would have said it was a joke a year earlier. The narrative board. This is the third board, and it is the one most people miss. While the capital is being assembled and the regulators are being charmed, Altman is also conducting a permanent campaign of meaning. He gives long, carefully framed interviews. He posts essays, The Intelligence Age, 3 Observations, that read like documents written by a man who is not just running a company, but defining the philosophical context in which the company will be evaluated. He warns about the existential risk of artificial general intelligence in the same speeches in which he urges the world to accelerate. He famously remarks that he keeps gold, antibiotics, batteries, and a piece of land in Big Sur in case civilization collapses. A line that gets quoted over and over as evidence of his honesty about what he is building. But notice the structure of that line. It is the lighthouse keeper warning you about the storm. While building the storm, he is, simultaneously, the person sounding the alarm and the person whose company is the loudest source of the sound being alarmed about. And by being both, he becomes the only credible interpreter of the danger. That is the move. That is the position. That is the third board. Capital, regulation, narrative. He plays them at the same time, and he plays them with a calm, almost a stillness, that is its own kind of weapon. He does not raise his voice in interviews. He does not lose his temper. When the board fired him, he did not fight publicly. He let his employees fight for him. When investors get nervous, he tells them, in a voice that sounds like he is reading the weather forecast, that they should be nervous, and that he is too, and that this is exactly why the work has to continue, with him at the center of it. The hidden plan, and here is where I want to use the phrase again, has never been hidden in the conventional sense. It has been hidden the way a building is hidden, too large to see if you stand close. Step back, and the shape becomes obvious. The shape is this. Place yourself at the intersection of capital, regulation, and narrative for the most consequential technology of the century, and become the person without whom none of the boards can be played. There are cracks. There are always cracks. Ilya Sutskever, the chief scientist, left in 2024. Jan Leakey, the head of the team responsible for aligning superintelligent systems with human values, resigned shortly after, writing publicly that safety culture had taken a back seat to shiny products. The entire super alignment team, built specifically to prevent catastrophic outcomes from advanced AI, was effectively dissolved. Former employees came forward to say they had been required to sign non-disclosure agreements that, if violated, would have cost them their already vested equity. Altman said he had not known about that clause. The company changed it. The lawsuit from Elon Musk arrived, accusing OpenAI of betraying its founding mission. The lawsuit from the New York Times arrived, alleging that the company had trained its models on copyrighted journalism without permission or payment. The board member Helen Toner, after she was removed, publicly described what she said had been a pattern of withholding information from the directors. None of these cracks have closed. They are still there. They are still open, and the company has continued to grow through them, around them, faster than the cracks can spread. Briefly, before we close this out, drop a comment and tell me honestly, do you trust the man building the most powerful technology in human history to also be the one writing the rules that govern it? I am genuinely curious what you think. Now back to the story, because the story does not have a clean ending. By 2026, the Stargate project, that $500 billion announcement on the White House lawn, is, by multiple reports, in turbulence. The information has reported that the joint venture has not staffed up, that OpenAI and SoftBank have clashed over basic questions about where to build, that OpenAI has quietly bypassed Stargate to sign separate deals, a $30 billion a year arrangement with Oracle, deepening relationships with CoreWeave and Microsoft and Amazon. Industry analysts have begun to ask openly whether the announced numbers were ever real or whether they were narrative, staged for political and market effect, with the actual structure being assembled more quietly underneath. Anthropic, the rival AI lab founded by former OpenAI researchers, has, by some measures, overtaken OpenAI in both annual revenue and private valuation. The bubble, if it is a bubble, is no longer something only the skeptics talk about. It is something Altman himself addresses, on stage, with that same calm. Yes, he says, there will be casualties. Yes, some people will lose money. Yes, this is what every infrastructural moment in history has looked like. And yes, the work continues. So what is actually being built? Not what the press releases say. What is actually being built? A small number of companies, 3, possibly 4, are racing to construct the computational foundation of the next economy. Whoever wins that race will own, in some functional sense, the substrate on which a generation of products, services, decisions, and institutions will run. Not the apps, the substrate, the thing the apps run on, the operating system of the next century, and the man at the center of one of those companies, the one who, more than any other, has positioned himself at the intersection of the capital, the regulation, and the narrative, is the same man who, on a Friday afternoon in November 2023, was fired by his own board and walked back in 72 hours later as something larger than a chief executive. As an institution, there is a final piece to this. It is not whether Sam Altman is good or bad. That is a question for biographers, and the biography is not finished. The piece I keep coming back to is the question of who actually decided that this is how the most consequential technology in human history should be built. Was there a vote? Was there a public debate? Was there a moment at which the citizens of any country were asked whether they wanted 3 or 4 private companies, financed by sovereign wealth funds, and $1 trillion of speculative capital to construct the cognitive infrastructure of the next era? There was not. There was a series of announcements. There were investor calls. There were Senate hearings, where the man who would benefit most from the rules being proposed was the one helping to propose them. The hidden plan, and this is the third and final time I will use the phrase, was not hidden because anyone hid it. It was hidden because we were not looking, or because we were looking at the wrong thing. We were watching the chatbot. We were watching the demos. We were watching the firings and the rehirings and the dramas. And while we were watching all of that, the architecture went up around us. Capital, regulation, narrative, infrastructure, talent. All of it assembled in plain sight by a 39-year-old man who learned in a chapel in St. Louis that the way to take control of a room is to surface the truth before anyone else does, and who has been doing it on bigger stages ever since. And the question, the open one, the one I want to leave you sitting with, is not whether he succeeds. He may not. The architecture may hold, or it may collapse under the weight of the contradictions inside it, or it may transform into something none of us can yet name. The question is who, on the day it is finished, will own the keys, and whether by the time we collectively look up and ask that question, it will already be too late to ask anyone but him.